It is Talk, 25 to 3. We're going to talk to Helen Joyce in just 1 second. A couple of comments from you on the booze question. Mike says, in relation to your alcohol issue, your alcohol question rather, imagine the 150 deaths a week as a British Airways flight crashing every week. I can guarantee it wouldn't be long until a solution was found by the government or the airlines. Why are alcohol deaths acceptable is the question you should be asking. Well, it's a good point. Yes, the airline analogy is always a powerful one. If you look at it in that term, the equivalent of a passenger flight crashing on a weekly basis, that's the death toll we're looking at. Then people will go, wow, that's unacceptable. It's a bit like road crashes. You know, you have road crashes and how many people, kids that are injured in road traffic accidents. Astonishing number on a weekly basis, but very little gets talked about that either. Funny times. Now, the government said they will allow some transgender women to use some single-sex spaces intended for females. Prior to this, of course, Sir Keir Starmer stated that it was very important to protect female-only spaces, another backtrack that Labour seems to have taken. So how far does this go? Are all spaces going to be just mixed gender? Let's speak to the Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters, Helen Joyce. Always good to get your views on these things, Helen. Good afternoon to you. What do you sense is going on over there at Labour HQ?
Yeah, so the background to this is the previous government, when Kemi Badenoch was doing Women and Equalities, she was sick of people like civil servants and other people saying to her that there was no evidence that women were losing single-sex spaces. So she put out a call for evidence that was asking people to send examples of bad rules for accessing single-sex spaces. So either organisations saying you can come in to the women-only space if you identify as a woman, or indeed adding on to the bottom of that as insult to injury, saying the Equality Act says that men who identify as women can come in. And she got all this evidence, and what happened yesterday is that the Labour government said that they're not going to publish it, that they're going to pass the 10% worst examples to the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they're basically just not going to do anything with the other 90%, which they put out a statement about that, honestly, I can only say was not legally particularly impressive. And it seemed to suggest that an organisation that lets men who identify as women into women's spaces is free to do that as long as it doesn't claim it's on the basis of the Equality Act. That's nonsense. Complete nonsense, and not compatible with the promise to protect single-sex spaces. So it's incredibly disappointing. I cannot tell you how disappointed those of us who campaign for single-sex spaces are.
And I would sense, Helen, that the government know exactly what they're doing here. This is a kind of a way of convoluting the story to get the result many of them probably really want, and that is that...
I'm really not sure.
Am I being too cynical there?
Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but, you know, Keir Starmer and colleagues did move during the general election. They did move away from saying idiotic things about the share of women who have penises. And they didn't have to put that they support single-sex provision in the manifesto, but they did. Honestly, the thing that came out yesterday was so confusingly and badly written. When I talked to journalists yesterday to try to brief them, they were saying, but what does this sentence mean? What are they going on about here? And I'm going like, no, your guess is as good as mine. Yeah. Whoever wrote it, whether that was a civil servant or a spad, honestly doesn't understand the Equality Act.
Sure.
At all. So, I mean, what I would say is they have burned a lot of credibility here, an awful lot, and they need to move quickly to get that credibility back, because women are really sick of being gaslit on the subject of single-sex spaces.
I mean, I know we've said this before, Helen, but, you know, this is... I'd love a time machine just to go back so that we could play the conversation we're having now to people, even 10 or 15 years ago. People would go, what is this? Is this a new comedy show? What's the deal here? How did we arrive here in a very short period of time, a breathtakingly short period of time? You know, we've got to this stage where we're having a debate as to whether blokes should be able to use women's changing rooms.
I mean, yes, like, you know, it's the most basic logical statement that if men can come in, it's not women only. Like, you don't need the Equality Act to tell you that.
True.
So somebody who says they support single-sex spaces is saying they understand you can't let men into women's spaces. It's very painful to have to say this over and over and over again to people who are paid to work for all of us in government, in the civil service, in the various regulators. And yet we are having to say it over and over again because somehow there's a brain worm that makes these people think that if the man says he's a woman, you should or you must let him in.
But where would you... That's the sort of thing like a 4-year-old might say. I mean, it's such an anti-intellectual position. The fact that somebody says it, I mean, this is... Is it gaslighting? Is it stupidity? What the heck is it, Helen?
I mean, I don't have a window into people's souls, but a lot of the time it's both of those things, and also an awful lot of disinformation. So organisations like Stonewall have spent many years telling people that trans women are women. That means men who identify as women are women. That's so obviously stupid that you really have to get young. Well, you have to start young when you're trying to get people to believe that. So they tell kids in school that now. And then people want to be kind. They think that there's some special sort of man who's really a woman inside and that you'd be awfully mean not to let him in. And they don't think to themselves, well, what about women? What about being kind to women?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, it's not that hard, this one, is it? I mean, it's really rather a sort of simple set of situations on the table there. And there's...
It's not intellectually hard, but it's morally hard because a lot of people don't have a backbone. And they don't have any courage.
Well, it's a little bit like when these characters knock on the doors of big corporations and say, "Oh, we're from the." I'm trying to think what the correct term is, but we're here to make sure your staff aren't racists. Basically, you go critical EDI, critical race theory, all of that stuff. And of course, the big banks, they go, "Wow, yeah, come in. What, £5,000 a head? No problem at all, sir. There's £2 million. Make our staff all non-racist, please." And you think, well, they weren't racist to start with, but somebody's trousered £2 million for running a couple of courses, and everybody goes to bed feeling like they're a nicer person. It's a nonsense.
I mean, actually, it's often a lot cheaper than 2 million, and that's a lot of the reason why it happens. This is the incredibly cheap version of inclusion. Yeah. You pay somebody to come in, tell you you're all racist and that men can be women. You give them often a depressingly small amount, and then you screw up your entire company's policies. You go gender neutral in the toilets. You say everyone has to have pronouns. And then you say, because they told you that the Equality Act makes you do this. The government is meant to understand better than that. Labour wrote the Equality Act, and they say they're proud of it. And yet, yesterday, they did not show any evidence of understanding the law that they had passed themselves, and they did not show any evidence of doing what you need to do what they said in their manifesto, which is to protect single-sex spaces, and, by the way, also reduce violence against women and girls. Well, how easy is that going to be if you allow any man who says he's a woman into women-only spaces, like changing rooms, for God's sake?
Yes. I mean, again, I always sound slightly flummoxed by us having a conversation that we're being forced to have that is just a remarkably stupid conversation, but we're having to have it because of other people's remarkable stupidity, I guess, naivety, or whatever it happens to be. There is another story under this banner a little bit that we thought we'd ask you about, Helen. Lady Samantha Cain. I don't know much about Lady Samantha Cain, other than Samantha Cain is a very rich person who I think owns a pile somewhere, a laird, as I think the phrase goes, suing the NHS for refusing a third sex change surgical procedure. Cain transitioned to female in 1997, but then in 2004 reverted back to male, deciding I don't much like this female stuff anymore, and then sought to become a female again in 2017. The NHS refused the request, leading to a private surgery in Serbia back in 2018, which apparently caused some complications. Cain is now claiming NHS negligence, discrimination, human rights breaches, seeking £162,000 worth of damages. I would just add that if you've got a £5 million castle, you can pay for your own surgery, couldn't you?
I mean, what we're talking about here is operating on one of the most sensitive and delicate parts of the human anatomy, namely the groin. This is a man who had his male parts removed and presumably some version that's meant to look like female parts made out of the tissue that remained, then changed his mind about that, and I don't know what they could have done because what they took off in the first place will have been thrown away, frankly, but anyway, they must have done something, and then wants to do it all again. Now, anyone who has had any operation on any bit of their body, if you've had your appendix out or anything like that, you know scar tissue isn't the same as the original tissue, and you can't get back bits that you cut off.
Sure.
So you can't do this. We are not Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head. We are actual living mammals who cannot just be messing around with bits of our bodies like this. I'd say the first operation was the one that was probably a mistake, but I mean, he was an adult. If he wants to do this, we can't exactly stop him. But he can't expect the NHS to go along with endlessly operating on the same part of the body.
And also, why would this be? When Beveridge and Co., put together the NHS and what it was meant to do and stand for, I don't think anybody had this in mind, did they? The NHS is up against the wall financially. I'm not absolutely sure this should ever be regarded as something that's carried out, unless there is some very, very specific circumstance, and I can't imagine what that would be, to the point of prioritising procedures such as this.
Wanting bits cut off and then reattached and then cut off again, frankly, does not suggest to me somebody who is in a mental state to be able to properly consent to any of this.
I don't think you've got a downstairs problem. I think you've got an upstairs problem, perhaps. And I'm trying to say that kindly.
I mean, yes, this is a person who has issues, shall we put it that way. Whether trying to cut things off again after they've already been cut off is the way to resolve them seems doubtful to me, to say the least.
There it is. Helen, thank you as ever. Always good to speak. Helen Joyce, Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters.